Events happen that change our lives. Dealing with change is what we do. We discuss with industry professionals objective solutions to work through cherished items and family memories. When we go beyond the gavel, we provide tools and information to deal with these crisis times. Hello, my name is Shane Feely, owner of Auction Solutions, Inc. I spend my days liquidating assets and conducting personal property auctions and appraisals. The auction method of marketing with competitive bidding produces the market value of real estate, construction equipment, household estates, coin collections, and more. In my 20 years of auction action, I've encountered hundreds of families who are facing the loss of a loved one, a business, a divorce, or other life-changing experiences. Many times I come across a business owner or a family who have had a loved one experience a catastrophic illness which changes their lives. I have many years of experience with professionals who have skills to assist families who are now in a dysfunction mode and making decisions under duress. Today we go beyond the gavel to visit with Steve Schmidt, attorney at law with Carlson Burnett. I came across his blog a week ago and I reached out to him because I think he has some points that we need to know. Welcome, Steve. Thanks for coming to Beyond the Gavel.
Thanks for having me. Good to be here.
So I was looking on the internet and I saw your blog. What prompted you to write that blog?
I wrote the blog just because we need a way to kind of reach out to folks that need services to help with planning for the cost of long-term care. There are some people that have purchased long-term care insurance, but a lot of people haven't really thought through what happens if one of us has to go into the nursing home. And today we don't see as many people in the nursing home, but assisted living or even in-home health care can be very expensive. So how do you protect assets to make sure that you don't run out of money before you pass away?
Okay, and I think you talk about a series of threats. Would you like to go into that just a little bit? And we'll take them on one by one as you think the importance level is.
Sure. So as an estate planning attorney, I'm used to talking about what happens when somebody's thinking about becoming disabled or passing away. What kind of threats do they face? I think a lot of times our culture has looked at maybe two of those threats, and that has to do with, do we go through the probate process or the court system, and do we have to pay taxes? So taxes and probate have gotten a lot of attention, but really there's a couple of other threats that we don't necessarily talk about as often, but sometimes they're a lot more prevalent than those two threats. It has to do with family situations. You mentioned this family dysfunction. So we see a lot of different family situations. Maybe one of the kids isn't making good decisions. Maybe the kids don't get along. Maybe the parents don't get along. All sorts of family situations a lot of times aren't taken into account. And then another one that's become a lot more important lately has to do with the cost of long-term care. Used to be a long time ago, maybe 50 years ago, 70 years ago, a lot of times if we got an illness, we passed away rather suddenly. But anymore, with the advances in health care, people are living longer, and so a lot of times that we have quality of life, but sometimes we have situations where somebody's living, maybe they're living in assisted living for many years, and that's not cheap. It costs a lot of money, and so how do we pay for that? And again, sometimes people have the resources, but a lot of times people are like, we don't have the resources, what do we do now?
Right, that's correct. Well, you have 7 threats listed here, and you have threat number 1 is to the family security. Losing control or access to their stuff or the estate. Is that a big fear that the older people may have, our parents?
Yeah, everybody wants to stay in control as long as they can. So a lot of times parents say, hey, I don't want to go do this, I don't want to maybe get up a power of attorney because I'm giving up control. What they don't realize is getting a power of attorney and getting good documents in place is actually keeping control. It's keeping control because now they can make sure that the right people are making those decisions. Maybe it's one of their kids, maybe it's an outside professional, but if they don't have the right documents in place, they're going to lose control much more quickly because now you have maybe several of the kids in there fighting for control, or maybe you have somebody on the outside saying, hey, there's a problem here. And so actually getting good documents in place is a way for them to keep control.
Okay. And when you talked a little bit on your blog, it was about having the talk. Well, we're talking not about the talk that you have with your son or your daughter when they're younger. We're talking about the talk with your parent. Would you like to go into that just a little bit? I'd like to know, when is a good time to have that talk?
It's going to be different in every situation, and that's what I think is so difficult for kids. When we're growing up, obviously our parents are parenting us, and it's very difficult to think about that role reversal. When is it time for us to step in and maybe make some decisions for our parents. Maybe it's not clear to us, are our parents okay or are they not okay? And so it involves a whole lot of different issues between parent and child. It also just involves issues between siblings. Siblings often will have very different viewpoints on what's best for mom and dad. And so it requires communication between everybody in the family situation. And you have to think to yourself, okay, are my parents able to make good decisions financially? Are they okay? Are they in a safe place health-wise? And so you have to go through a whole list of questions in your own mind before you take the step. And for some kids, it's really hard to take that step and say, you know what, I do need to step in and take control because I know my parents don't want that. So sometimes the parents are saying, you know what, I think it's time, and they have a good relationship with their kids, and it's an easier transition. Even in the easy transition, though, it's still difficult. Do I give up driving? Do I have to move out of my house? And all those kinds of issues are really hard for a parent to deal with on their own, and often with their kids. But sometimes the parents just don't want to give up anything. They don't want to give up driving. They don't want to move out of the home place.
Yeah.
All those types of things. It gets really difficult.
It is very challenging. So you've had the conversation, and we know that they don't want to lose control of their estate and their driving and things like that. What do you see as a second threat to people, why they don't make decisions or have the talk? Is it because they don't know the law?
A lot of times people don't understand what the law is either, right? They think that, hey, I don't necessarily need to do anything, things will be just fine. And they don't realize that the law is there as a fail-safe, and nobody really wants that fail-safe. It's much better to actually step in and actually get things in place. And so a lot of times they don't necessarily trust other people. Maybe they don't have a good financial advisor, maybe they don't have a good CPA, sometimes they don't have a good attorney. But the people that really are successful are the ones that have the good support system in place. So I always encourage people when they come in to see me is to have the conversation with their kids about this is what's going on in my life and here's where I'm at. It used to be years ago that parents never told their kids about their finances. And again, when people would die quickly, that a lot of times wasn't an issue. But as people become incapacitated and maybe can't make decisions for years and maybe need some higher cost of living for many years, it's important to have that conversation and to have it a little bit sooner. And so I always tell parents, maybe not retirement age, but at some point in time, maybe when you're 65 or 70 or 75, it's time to start telling one of the kids, if you trust your kids, start telling at least one of the kids or maybe all the kids, here's what's going on. That's
a really great idea. And having the trust in one, hopefully they have trust in more than one, but at least one would know. And that's very important, especially at that time when they want their wishes handled. They may be so ill that there's nothing anybody can do, and that one, has to make that decision. And it can be a tough time with the other siblings and their feelings about what's going on in that situation.
Right, and so there's really two kinds of decisions that need to be made. One is on the financial side, and the other is on the healthcare side. And those decisions can be very different. And so sometimes maybe the person making the best decisions on the healthcare side should not be making the decisions on the financial side. And so you need to, how are they going to work together and how are decisions made? So, on the healthcare side, a lot of times it's important to have somebody that maybe lives close by. Or maybe you have somebody in the family with a medical background, a nurse or a doctor or somebody like that can really understand the healthcare side of decisions. Financial is a lot different. So financial, it's important to have somebody, first of all, with good record keeping to make sure that everybody that needs to know is going to know not only today but down the road exactly what's gone on to make sure that nobody's concerned about somebody stealing money or being handled inappropriately. Right. So on the financial side, you have good record keeping. You have somebody that understands investments to a certain extent, understand potential tax issues. And so it's important for the parents, whether it's a single parent or a couple, to make sure that they've got the good professionals they need, whether it's an attorney or financial advisor, and make sure that they have the right person actually handling the finances.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I truly believe that an attorney in any situation is going to be very helpful because they're able to referee and look at things objectively with no emotion and no sibling rivalry or anything else is going on when you've got an attorney in there. And we've had another one on here, the show as well, and it just makes things a lot calmer and quieter.
And attorneys have a lot of experience typically if they've been doing this very long, and I've been doing it over 25 years, so I've seen a lot of different potential landmines and good decisions and bad decisions, and so it's kind of easy for me to tell fairly quickly whether the kids really have mom and dad's best interests at heart. And so, we have adult protective services out there saying, hey, let's not do anything to harm mom and dad. And we see an increase in the need for adult protective services because kids do sometimes do crazy things. Sometimes it's somebody outside the family, but adult APS says that more often it's somebody inside the family is either not taking good care of mom and dad for health-wise or for financial.
Absolutely. And that's something that none of us like to think about, but it does happen out there, with our elder people and people who are ill. Maybe they can't make a decision and they've got someone in there who's making poor decisions for them. So I agree 100%. If we go into, let's just talk a little bit about probate. You mentioned taxes on an estate. How do they figure that? How does that work, and what is a probate?
So in Nebraska, we have a couple different taxes we look at. So most people don't care about federal estate taxes. The exemption is up so high now. It's $11 million per individual. Yeah. Most people don't care about that. But we still see a lot of tax issues. So we see more tax issues with income taxes and then with Nebraska inheritance taxes. So we work in both Nebraska and Iowa. In Iowa, we don't care about inheritance taxes typically because kids don't have to pay inheritance taxes. And in Nebraska, it's usually not a big factor because it's a pretty low amount for children. If it's not children, then we start to look at Nebraska inheritance taxes, or if we have a larger estate, then Nebraska inheritance taxes become more important. But income taxes can still certainly be an issue in a lot of estates. So whether it's step up, whether it's a highly appreciated asset, maybe it's a farm or some stocks and those types of things, we have income tax issues. Sometimes we have a large amount of like IRAs and qualified 401ks, qualified money, and there we have to worry about income taxes. So taxes is still definitely an issue, even though federal estate taxes are generally not an issue. And then the probate process, we like to avoid the probate process most of the time with clients, because if we're in the probate process, now we're going through more red tape, and now we have a judge involved, we have more attorney involvement, and so it becomes more expensive for the family. So there's almost always ways to avoid the probate process for most or all of the process.
That's great. What is a trust? Talk to me about trusts.
So a trust is similar to a will and similar in some ways to a power of attorney, but often it's more effective in my experience than either one of those because again, with a will we have to go through the probate process, the court process, and with a trust we can typically avoid it. So a power of attorney is, everybody probably knows what that is, right? If I have a power of attorney for health care, that means I name the person who's going to make health care decisions. If I have a power of attorney for financial, I name the person who's going to do financial decisions, whether it's my investments or pay bills and all sorts of financial things. Well, we can do a lot of those things, most of those things, through a trust. So if we use a trust, we have a really good vehicle typically when it's set up correctly to make a lot of financial decisions, and it's just an effective tool. A power of attorney is sometimes less effective. Going to pick on some of the big banks here a little bit. So if we have like a Wells Fargo or some of the large banks, they tend to be a little bit more picky when it comes to power of attorneys. And so if somebody has a power of attorney that's maybe 2 or 3 years old, they may say, hey, we're not going to work with that power of attorney. And so then it becomes a little more problematic to work with power of attorneys.
I understand. And I'm going to move on to threat number 3, your family security as a threat to our elders. Help me with that.
Sure. So we see a lot of family issues today that we probably didn't see 50 years ago. We see a lot more blended families. So if somebody passes away and maybe they've got kids and they remarry somebody else that has kids, how do we protect the assets to make sure that they take care of who they're supposed to? We see situations where it's not in place and now, so you have a second marriage situation and you have kids on both sides. Whoever lives the longest, maybe their kids get everything. And so you have a situation that's not good in that situation.
What do you think about predators? Describe predators to a family in an estate.
There's all sorts of predators. So we've talked about some of those already, but in the family situation, a lot of times maybe it's a child that's not making good decisions. But it can also be maybe a child's in just a bad situation. So A lot of times parents will leave their assets outright to their kids, and we don't know what's the situation going to be like. And so maybe 10 or 15 years down the road, that child's just in a bad situation. Maybe they're going through a divorce, or maybe their marriage is in a bad situation. Maybe somebody's suing them or whatever. And so maybe through no fault of their child, the child could end up losing a lot or all the inheritance.
Oh boy. So we talked about tax provisions a little bit. Another predator that you have down here is nursing homes and the cost of care.
As we all know, the cost of long-term care can be very expensive. The cost of nursing homes in Omaha is probably at least $5,000 a month. It may be as high as $7,000 or $8,000 a month. So it depends upon, obviously the cost of care, how much care is needed. But it can be very expensive. And so, yeah, that can definitely use up a person's assets very quickly. And it depends what kind of illness you have too. So some illnesses, the government will pay a lot of the cost. So if I get the right disease, if I have a heart attack, if I have something where I can recover fairly quickly, Medicare will often pay for a lot of the costs of the hospital and the recovery and that type of thing. If I have the wrong disease, if I have Alzheimer's, if I have MS or something like that, that can be very expensive over a period of years, and the government is very reluctant to step in and to pay any of those costs. And so there we can lose a lot of money over either a short period or a long period of time if you have the wrong illness. So
that comes into the threat number 4, your health fails. And it looks like you think that government benefits is a toughie.
A lot of times it can be very difficult. So we deal a lot with Medicaid planning, and sometimes my clients don't like to think about Medicaid planning. We have some of the greatest clients. They have worked hard their entire life, and they have maybe saved $100,000 or $500,000, but they're just the nicest, hardest working people. They don't like to think of going on Medicaid. They think of Medicaid as for poor people. And my goodness, I've worked hard and I've saved money, and I don't ever want to go on Medicaid. But again, if I only have a couple $100,000 in assets, and my cost of care is $8,000 a month or even higher. I've had some clients, their cost of care has been over $20,000 or $30,000 a month, so it can get very expensive very quickly. So threat number 5 you have to your family is failing to plan when you can. And we have had some conversations about that, and I totally agree. What would you need, just go through the basics with me. Sure. And it's different for everyone, but if I'm younger, maybe I'm still working, maybe I just started working out of college, got married, and had some kids. Definitely need some of the basic documents, which is I need a basic will, I need basic power of attorney. So that's kind of where we start with pretty much everybody. Once I become an adult, I need powers of attorney, and I need a basic will. Okay. What if you fail to plan? If you fail to plan, usually it's going to be a lot more expensive. So one of the big reasons people are reluctant to do some good planning, maybe they go online, maybe they just don't do anything, is because they think, hey, I don't want to spend this amount of money to do some planning. I'm just gonna put it off, and it becomes a lot more expensive down the road. Wow. So you have like another threat number 6. I shouldn't say that word like, but threat number 6 to your family security is not working with qualified professionals, and I think that's a very important issue. Absolutely. I talked earlier about making sure you have a good team in place. So a good financial advisor a lot of time is a key person, but you need to have a good attorney too. So there are literally hundreds of attorneys in the Omaha area that do estate planning. A lot of those attorneys will do other things too. And I'm not trying to be critical of other attorneys, but if I do estate planning, I do all sorts of other types of law too. Chances are my estate planning was state of the art, but maybe 20 years ago. No longer state of the art today. So estate planning has changed. Good estate planning has changed as life has changed. So again, we see a lot more issues with blended families and people living a lot longer. And a lot of things are different today than they were 50 years ago. So an estate plan that was state of the art 50 years ago is probably not a good estate plan today. So you recommend looking at your plan at least every 10 years. Or more often. Yeah, more often. We like to encourage our clients to look at it every 3 to 5 years, knowing full well if I'm young and I've done a good job doing estate planning, I just got married, had a couple kids, got my estate plan in place, A lot of times I'm not going to look at it for 15 or 20 years. I'm not going to be too hard on somebody like that. They got their estate plan done, that's great. But usually about every 5 years, I say as people are younger, about every 5 years, if I look at an estate plan, half of them are still really good, the other half needs some updating, and a lot of times it's major updating. So stuff changes.
Well, you've added children or maybe grandchildren, or as you mentioned, you've remarried, and how many people are now, you know, in your family, in your life, and that it changes a lot.
My assets change, the people who I went to make decisions change. Maybe it made sense to have my parents be involved in my estate plan when I was younger. Well, if I'm 55 years old, maybe my parents aren't the best option. Now maybe it's siblings, now maybe it's my kids. And so a lot of times the people involved is one of the most important things, and that changes over time.
If you don't have a will and you're 35, how do the cards fall as to how families are able to step in, and who's first in line, second in line? Could you go through that real quickly?
Becomes a lot more difficult. So it depends if you have kids, and I don't have all the details on that, but it depends if you have kids. So your spouse is going to get a certain percent if you're married, but not everything necessarily. So some may go to your kids directly. But there's just some issues with not having a good plan in place where you're not probably going to have the right person involved. So if you're 35 years old, chances are, and you're in a typical family situation, chances are you're going to have several people kind of looking over the shoulder and saying, okay, we need to get involved. And that's where a lot of times you end up having a court fight. And if you have a court fight, it's usually very expensive and very ugly. So you might have, you know, your spouse involved, you might have some parents involved, you might have some siblings involved, and it can get very bad very quickly.
Okay. Now, threat number 7 you have to your family's security is not knowing the costs. Let's talk about the real costs.
Sure. So there is certainly a cost to setting up good planning. So again, just setting a basic plan where you have a will, power of attorneys, and things like that can be pretty inexpensive. A lot of times it's maybe around $1,000, maybe less, maybe a little bit more, but it's not that expensive. And if you budget for it, you know, if you're going out and buying a brand new TV or something like that, you're probably paying a little bit more than that. So a good plan can save a ton of money down the road. And again, if I have a young couple setting up an estate plan and they don't look at it for 20 years, we may be okay. As we get older, maybe around retirement age, it can get a little more expensive. But again, now we're serious. Now we know, okay, there is a good chance I might not get my plan updated again before I pass away. I want to make sure I have my ducks in a row.
Absolutely.
And so it can get a little more expensive as we get trusts and other things involved like that, but it just depends on the situation.
If you put a trust in place, how long does it have to be in place, whether it's revocable or non-revocable, before it's solidified? Is there a rule for that?
So that's a great question. So revocable trusts, once we set them up, we're in great shape typically just right away. Now, we typically have to get the assets coordinated with the trust, so that might involve changing the title on some assets, beneficiary designations. So those things have to still happen, and those can take several weeks or several months depending upon who's doing it and how quickly they can happen. But a trust can be in place immediately. Irrevocable trusts, again, we can have those in place immediately, but there are some time factors with that. So again, if we're planning on how do we protect assets from the nursing home, from assisted living, that cost, there are some time factors involved in that. So there we like to have a good irrevocable trust set up 5 years, or at least 3 to 5 years before somebody is really in a situation where they're in assisted living. Because that way we can protect more of the assets and do a better job of making sure those assets are going to stay there as long as they need them.
Wow, that's great. What about if you have, it's less than 3 years? Is it broken? Is the trust broken? Or does that change the factoring on how you pay for your care?
Sure. And there's a whole lot of factors that go into how we structure that. So one factor is somebody in the facility already? Are they in assisted living or in the nursing home? Because that does change how we do things. So we call that crisis planning. Crisis planning meaning we would have preferred to have done it 3 years sooner, but here we are, and now we have more expenses than we have income, so it's a crisis. Crisis planning, we can still save a lot of assets. We can typically save maybe 50 or 60% of the assets even in a crisis plan. But we want to get started sooner rather than later, because every month we wait, we're losing whatever the cost of care is, $5,000, $6,000, $8,000 a month.
Incredible amounts.
So it goes very quickly. But yeah, the sooner we get started on that process, the better. But we can still save a lot of assets. But the process looks a little bit different when we're in crisis planning. Now we're looking at, okay, sure, there's a 5-year look back with Medicaid, but there's also something called the penalty period. So the penalty period has to do with, let's say I go ahead and get some planning in place and I use an irrevocable trust and I put some assets in that trust. That's a gift. So typically with an irrevocable trust for Medicaid, for this type of planning, we don't have mom and dad on as the beneficiary, we have the kids on as the beneficiary, so it's a gift. Now we make sure the kids understand that they're not supposed to go on a cruise or buy a new boat or a new car. This is supposed to be there as long as mom and dad need it. But it's a gift, and because it's a gift, that means it's a deprivation of resources for my client. And then we look at, okay, what is going to be the penalty and how long do they have to wait to actually get Medicaid? And that can be a year, it can be 2 or 3 years, just depending upon the situation.
I see. But not everybody has to spend down until they have just a sofa and a couple of chairs in their curio cabinet with a trust. It's a little more secure.
A little more secure, and we can definitely save more assets with the trust. A lot of people don't realize in the state of Nebraska, the most you can keep and go on Medicaid is $4,000. A lot of people think they have to spend everything before that.
Yeah.
But if we do some good planning and make a gift to a trust or do some things like that, we can actually save a lot of assets.
Well, Steve, I want to tell you thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, Steve Schmidt with Carlson Burnett. He's got 25 years, estate planning and attorney. Give him a call if you have some questions. I'm sure he can help you too. Thank you, Steve, for coming today.
Thank you.